Our little ones are at this moment engaged in a program called Godly Play, a Montessori-based Sunday school program that has completely captivated them. They have their own learning and worship space in the education wing, and they gather to worship and learn in the same way that we do in this space. Week after week, children as young as 3 years old gather around a storyteller to hear and watch the story of God's love unfold before them. Our storytellers are trained to tell the story in a particular way using a carefully worded script illustrated with beautifully crafted figures. The storytellers are trained to do something completely counterintuitive. They are trained to not look at the children as they teach, so that all eyes are on the figures, all ears on the words, rather than on the adult in front of them. Much of the storytelling time is silent as the figures are slowly moved into place. This morning, we want to share with you a small portion of the story of the Good Shepherd, today's gospel reading, with Sunday school coordinator Kate Berlin as the storyteller. Listen to the silences as much as you listen to the words. We have subtitles because her voice is very soft. Listen, watch, and then we'll talk. Kate told all those little lambs flocked around her, "I know each of my sheep by name, and the sheep know my voice." Many of the children probably imagine that Kate is Jesus because her voice is so welcoming and so safe, and she knows each child by name. What better model for the faith to imagine that Kate might be Jesus? I would follow that Jesus anywhere. But the story as John, the gospel writer, tells it is much more complex than the story our children are hearing this morning. John places Jesus in the temple during the festival of the dedication, a festival which we know as Hanukkah. And John cryptically notes it was winter. Not an Illinois winter with snow and cold and biting winds, not Game of Thrones winter with zombies and blood and death, but Middle East winter, cool, rainy, and dark. Perhaps Jesus was seeking silence for himself on a gray winter day, walking off the controversy that swirled around him everywhere he went. But his reverie was interrupted by religious leaders, curious religious leaders demanding for some identification. Tell us who you are. Tell us plainly. And much like the salesperson in a high-end shop who patronizes, if you have to ask how much it costs, you can't afford it. Jesus smiles. If you have to ask me who I am, you probably don't belong to me. Ouch. Believe it or not, this short little story has generated centuries of theological controversy. Was Jesus saying that some just belong to him and some just don't? That there's nothing we can do or say to become part of Jesus' flock? That it's already been decided? Was Jesus arguing for predestination, a 19th century theory that the dice of salvation are cast before you are born? Some are sheep, some are not. Too bad, so sad. But if you know Jesus at all, you know that's not the case. Sadly, we make the mistake of thinking that Jesus thinks the way we do, that Jesus thinks as we do, that some people are worth our trouble and some people are not, that some people are worth our time and some people are not. That's us. That's not how Jesus thinks. So listen again to what Jesus said to his challengers. He didn't tell them it was too late. He didn't tell them he was turning his back on them, that there was no hope. He said, "My sheep hear my voice." It's not about predestination. It's not about popularity. It's not even a lottery. It's about our ears. Do we hear Jesus' voice, or have we chosen not to listen? In my family, we call that husband hearing, the domestic phenomenon that our spouses hear every voice but ours. Anybody else's house? I'm kidding, sort of. Here's what I think Jesus means. I think that Jesus' voice is clear enough for all to hear, but that some of us have chosen not to. Either because we don't believe what Jesus says about himself, or more likely, we don't believe what Jesus says about us. What does he say about himself? That he is Son of Mary and Son of God, the long-expected Messiah. Why, some ask, would I believe something as far-fetched as that? And so they don't listen to Jesus anymore because they don't believe what he says about himself. But most of us who struggle to hear have a hard time hearing because of what Jesus says, not about himself, but about us. We are each keenly aware of our faults and our failures, the inconsistencies in our characters, the darkness in our hearts. We are daily confronted with all that we lack, sometimes in our homes, sometimes in our work, but even in our play. We are pushed to be different, pushed to be more, to be better, to work harder, to work longer, to perform at a higher level, to do whatever it is the people around us want us to do, which is often a moving target. A good friend of mine, my age, has been in sales his whole career. He's risen to the top of his field, has been awarded National Salesperson of the Year, year over year over year. And every year he beats his marks, he exceeds his goals, he lifts the whole team and has, by his work, changed his whole industry. But a few years ago, the corporation for which he worked started raising his marks to unreasonable levels. If he exceeded the previous year's goal by 5%, the next year they expected him to exceed it by 10%, one year by 20%. They kept setting unattainable expectations for him, hoping, we later learned, that he would leave before they had to fire him. That pressure, that fear of failure nearly destroyed him. It pushed every self-critical, self-destructive button in his psyche. His employer was telling him, at least what he heard was, that he was worthless, that he was lazy, that he was a fraud, that everything he'd done for them for 20 years hadn't made any difference at all. None of it was true. But that judgmental voice whispered in his ear for months and even for years. His experience is not unusual. We are never good enough. We are never smart enough. We are never fast enough, strong enough, rich enough, pretty enough, kind enough. Whatever it is we ought to be, we aren't. And we live with the realization that failure is always a possibility. And some want us to believe it is an inevitability. Who tells us that? Why would they tell us that? And more important, why would we listen? That's why it is so hard for us to believe the voice of the Good Shepherd, the voice of Jesus who says, I will keep you safe, the Jesus who says, I love you, the Jesus who leads us, as Kate said to the children, to the good grass. We laughed about that all week. Lead us to the good grass. Hardly anybody speaks to us that way. Hardly anybody in any arena of our lives says, I love you as you are, and nothing you can do will change that. Jesus' opponents on that cool, gray Hanukkah day simply couldn't hear what he said about them, what he said about himself, because the voices in their heads were so loud. They couldn't think of themselves as lambs because they lived among wolves, wolves eager to pounce at the first sign of weakness. But I am the good shepherd, Jesus said in a calm, comforting, Kate-like voice. My sheep hear my voice. Our children are, at this moment, learning to hear Jesus' voice in the voice of their teachers. Who speaks so kindly to you? Who has taught your ear to listen for the voice of the shepherd? And when you speak, is it in tones that are kind, words that are encouraging, caring? Or do you join the voices of the world that simply add to the destructive din and hatred and violence all around us? Perhaps someone will learn to recognize Jesus' voice because they first hear yours. The life of the sheep, the life of faith, is a daily decision to listen. Not to the voices of competition and criticism that surround us, but to the voice of the Good Shepherd. You are safe, you are loved, you are mine, and no one can snatch you from my hand.